Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous material on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intend to consider today's measures en bloc. The measures are H.R. 2615, the United States Northern Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act, Omar, Cires, Wagner, Engel, and McCall amendments to that. H.R. 2744, the USAID Branding Modernization Act. H.R. 598, Georgia Support Act. H.R. 2140, the Preventing Child Marriage Act with a Wagner Amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.R. 2023, the Protect European Energy Security Act with an Engel Amendment. H.R. 2046, the Energy Diplomacy Act with a McCall Amendment. House Resolution 129, condemning the government of Saudi Arabia's continued detention and alleged abuse of women's rights activists with an Engel Amendment in the nature of a substitute. House Resolution 372, expressing concern for the United States-Turkey alliance, and the Engel Amendment in the nature of a substitute to House Resolution 345, recognizing widening threats to freedoms of the press and expression around the world, reaffirming the centrality of a free and independent press to the health of democracy, and reaffirming freedom of the press as a priority of the United States. At this time, I recognize myself to speak on today's business. We have 9 good bipartisan bills before us today, and I'm pleased to support every one of them. I want to first mention the United States Northern Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act, which I introduced along with Ranking Member McCall to address the root causes of migration from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Mr. McCall and I visited El Salvador in March, just as the Trump administration announced that it was cutting off assistance to the Northern Triangle countries. We saw firsthand the positive impact that U.S. foreign assistance is having in creating much-needed opportunities and stemming violence in those countries. We need to continue to invest in a safer and more prosperous Central America to create more opportunities for the people living there. This bill does just that by authorizing $577 million in assistance for Central America. This is a good bill, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting it. Providing foreign assistance helps people who are both in need and furthers our foreign policy objectives. In El Salvador, when Mr. McCall and I visited programs that teach young adults software engineering, it gave me such pride to see the USAID logo, which was visible to all. So I'm pleased to support the USAID Branding Modernization Act, a bill I'm proud to co-sponsor with Mr. McCall. This legislation affirms the obligation to brand foreign assistance as appropriate and requires a comprehensive review to ensure that USAID-funded projects are appropriately branded in the field. Human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are core American values and should underpin everything we do overseas. So I'm glad that we are considering a number of bills today that promote human rights and freedom of expression. First, Ms. Wagner's Preventing Child Marriage Act, which recognizes the problem of child marriage, particularly among vulnerable refugee populations. Every year, over 10 million girls marry before the age of 18. Early marriage denies children, especially girls, their right to make vital decisions about their well-being, including their health, family, and career. Child brides are less likely to finish their education, and they're at higher risk for abuse, contracting HIV, and dying from pregnancy. This bill tackles this issue by encouraging the U.S. to use its influence to help ensure that displaced populations have the protections and tools to avoid illegal child marriage, work that organizations like UNFPA are doing around the world. It's a good bill to empower young women and girls, and I'm proud to support it. Next, we have House Resolution 129, authored by Representatives Frankel and Wagner, which focuses on the unjust imprisonment of women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia. We must continue to call on the Saudi government to release these women immediately. I strongly support this resolution, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I'll turn now to House Resolution 345, which recognizes that freedom of the press is under threat around the world. Thank you to Mr. Chabot and Mr. Schiff for their work on this legislation. There are far too many violent, shocking examples of journalists being imprisoned, tortured, and murdered around the world. A free press is critical to any democracy. It shines a light on corruption and impunity. This resolution condemns threats to independent media and calls on governments to continue to address journalists' safety. It has my strong support. America's alliances and partnerships are another key pillar of our foreign policy. So I'm glad that a number of the measures in our markup today deal with our allies and diplomacy. The Georgia Support Act, authored by Mr. Connolly and Mr. Kinzinger, called for continued U.S. support for Georgia, an important U.S. partner. Georgia was invaded by Russia in 2008, and the Kremlin continues to attack Georgia through subversive disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks. H.R. 598 provides Georgia with assistance to combat this threat and support its democratic institutions. It's a good bill to advance the U.S.-Georgia relationship, and I'm glad we're moving it forward today. The Protect European Energy Security Act also combats Russia's increasingly malign encroachment on our European partners. The Nord Stream 2 and the Turk Stream gas pipelines from Russia to Germany and Turkey would increase European dependence on Russian energy sources. H.R. 2023 restates our opposition to these projects and requires the administration to report on how they impact European security and susceptibility to Russian influence. Next, we have the House Resolution number 372, a measure I introduced with Mr. McCall on the U.S.-Turkey relationship. President Erdogan has tightened his grip on power and rolled back democracy in Turkey. At the same time, he's cozied up to Putin and purchased the Russian S-400 air and missile defense system. Today's resolution condemns Erdogan for his authoritarian behavior and calls on Turkey to cancel delivery of the Russian weapons system. Of course, they want us to sell them our system, but we cannot do that if they don't cancel delivery of the Russian weapons system. They can't have it both ways. You can't have a NATO country buying Russian equipment. Finally, we have Mr. Wright's Energy Diplomacy Act. For the United States to maintain a leading role on the global stage, the State Department must be positioned to protect and promote favorable energy policies abroad. This bill creates and authorizes the creation of a new Assistant Secretary position to lead this charge. So in conclusion, I'm pleased to support all of these bills, and I'd like to thank our members for their hard work. And I will now recognize our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.